The last day of the Zeppelin company seemed near as Americans were being trained to operate the U.S. Navy's new LZ-126, which they would redesignate the ZR-3. There seemed to be little hope of a future with the German Airship Company after the October 1924 delivery of the new ship, christened USS Los Angeles. A dozen Zeppelin engineers accompanied Dr. Carl Arnstein to Akron, Ohio that fall to help form the Goodyear Zeppelin Corporation. Paul Litchfield worked out a deal that traded Goodyear airship patents with those of the Zeppelin works. The new company first envisioned the Goodyear Zeppelin I, a luxurious liner which could carry more passengers over longer distances than enlarged World War I designs. U.S. Navy conceptual artists who had studied the Zeppelin's naval role in the Great War saw the rigid airship enhancing the traditional scout cruiser. Bureau of Aeronautics Design Number 60 sought to define a new fleet airship. Each carrying aeroplanes, a fleet of 10 to 12 modern Zeppelin scouts would have complemented the slower, more expensive gun cruisers. Over in England, copies of naval Zeppelins, converted for commercial experiments after the war, were abandoned in favor of all new designs more than twice the size of wartime craft. U.S. Navy planners realized similar performance with helium would require at least 6 million cubic feet. Congress authorized the construction of 2 such ships after the USS Shenandoah broke apart in an Ohio thunderstorm. In Glendale, California, Slate Aircraft had finished a hangar and was building their unique metal-clad airship with advanced features. Like an ocean vessel, metal airships seemed to some to be the wave of the future. In the Midwest, brilliant young engineer Ralph Upson had already left Goodyear to pursue his vision of a non-flammable airship whose major components wouldn't have to be periodically replaced. Upson and his cosmopolitan group formed the Aircraft Development Corporation to make all-metal airships. Early in 1928, the Navy gambled precious funds on a demonstrator metal-clad airship. The first rivet was installed in the bow section on the 7th of March, 1928. The key to its success was Edward J. Hill's automatic riveting machine that joined the sheets of alclad aluminum together with 5,000 rivets an hour. The stressed skin was reinforced by main rings and transverse girders, held together by 3,500,000 rivets. The ship was assembled in 2 great halves. About this time in Germany, the Locarno treaties had eased the restrictions on commercial airship development. Hugo Eckener eventually raised enough money to start building a new passenger liner. The new LZ-127 would be built to the maximum size allowed by the remaining construction shed. 100 feet in diameter and 776 feet long, the LZ-127 would have a volume of 3,700,000 cubic feet for transoceanic capability. Back in Washington, the Bureau of Aeronautics now offered a rigid airship scout, or ZRS, design competition. Goodyear Zeppelin was the most realistic contractor, submitting 3 possible designs. Metal-clads were not considered. Finally, a contract for 2 prototypes was signed with Goodyear Zeppelin on October 6, 1928. The company first planned to enlarge the classic Zeppelin design into the 4th Navy rigid, but the use of fireproof helium allowed engine mounting inside for a more streamlined hull. The design's built-up main rings offered the huge frame greater strength and, together with triangular keels, offered ship-wide personnel access. Conceptual drawings showed a ship as long as the U.S. Capitol building, bristling with big guns. Goodyear Zeppelin was investing in the future, so its construction shed would be much larger to accommodate future generations of 10 or 15 million cubic foot ships. The company considered California, but the city of Akron agreed to a new airport site. With President Paul Litchfield's symbolic groundbreaking, construction began as 1 million cubic yards of earth were moved to level the field. Using a patented design by Dr. Arnstein, architects Wilbur Watson and Associates engineered the largest clear space building in the world. First came 1,300 25-foot pilings to support a floor of 15,000 cubic yards of concrete, held together with 700 tons of reinforcing steel. Tie-downs for clamps were cast every 10 feet. Next came 1.5 miles of railroad track to support 7 locomotive cranes. The 11 main arches were spaced 80 feet apart. Only the 3 center arches were set in concrete. The other footers featured huge pin and roller arrangements that allowed the giant structure to breathe. Atmospheric pressure changes could cause lateral movements of up to 4 inches in the length. Arches were built to the crane's 100-foot limit. Then the center section was counterweighted into place using telltales for alignment. The arches, with a 562-foot perimeter and their supports, consumed more than 5,000 tons of steel. The Graf Zeppelin had made his first flight to America in October of 1928. On another trip, Paul Litchfield proudly showed the visiting Hugo Echner details of the air dock construction. The clear center area was 1,100 feet long and 325 feet wide. The 364,000 square foot floor could accommodate a half dozen concurrent football games. There were 2 sets of end diagonal arches. Each of the 4 600-ton doors were supported by 40 27-inch steel wheels riding on double railroad tracks. 4 125 horsepower motors could move each door as much as 40 feet per minute around the upper 6-foot-long 17-inch pins. Even the strongest wind could not overcome the door's self-locking rack and pinion drive. During this time, the U.S. Navy had come to employ the airplane-carrying warship the British originally employed to fight Zeppelins shadowing their fleet. 2 former battle cruiser hulls were being converted into flat tops. A high-performance fighter small enough not to crowd the flight decks was called for with the Navy's Design No. 96 competition. By now, airplane manufacturers had hit on a new idea: discard wood and use airship metal to make airplane parts. The Glenn Curtiss Company, having used airship metal for the wing ribs of its Robin endurance flyer, created the first largely aluminum airplane for their entry into the Navy competition. The Curtiss prototype was designated XF-9C1. The plane was indeed tiny, but design number 96 could not be fulfilled with the technology of the day. The XF-9C1 was judged too difficult to handle and was rejected. Back at Akron, the Zeppelin rigid scout design was being finalized. There would be 12 individual gas cells housed in a dozen bays. The metric system was used to number the frames forward from frame 0, the rudder post. It was thought the heavy but sturdy deep main rings made the standard Zeppelin's cruciform tail reinforcement unnecessary. Each fin would tie in with 3 main rings. The crew's quarters were to straddle the aeroplane hangar. A 4-legged truss structure would support the airship's squadron. The engines, mounted in fireproof interior enclosures, would spin a shaft out to an outrigger gearhead. Arnstein's team decided to simplify access and structural complexity by moving the engines in a single line along the keels. The Aluminum Company of America delivered sheets of duraluminum 17 SRT to Goodyear's plant number 3. Sheets were stamped with Dr. Arnstein's patented lightning holes that stiffened the lightweight parts. Arnstein oversaw design and construction, with the work inspected by record-setting Navy balloonist Lieutenant Tex Settle. Back at Slate Aircraft in California, the city of Glendale was completed. With its exotic steam propulsion, it seemed to be the most advanced airship in the world. But later, after more conventional propulsion was adopted, a valve jammed and the hot California sun expanded her hydrogen until her rivets popped. Leaking badly, she was judged beyond practical repair. In Detroit, Upson & Company's prototype was assembled and sealant applied inside. The blimp-like control car was attached and valves installed. The hull was flooded with carbon dioxide, then helium was forced in from the top to displace the heavier gas until the great metal balloon floated. The new ZMC-2 took to the air on the 19th of August, 1929. After tests were completed, Army Captain William Kepner and Mechanic Sergeant Joe Bishop joined Navy Lieutenant Jim Dugan for the 600-mile flight from Detroit to Lakehurst. The Metal-clad would join the other experimental buoyant craft in Hangar 1, but the Metal-clad would never receive very much attention since Navy LTA thinking was dominated by the more conventional Zeppelin design. The stock market may have just crashed, but the atmosphere at Akron was jovial on the 7th of November as the USS Los Angeles and blimps hovered above the unfinished air dock. 30,000 people watched Admiral William Moffett squeeze the ZRS ship's golden rivet. Moffett congratulated Arnstein, and the work of drilling and squeezing would be duplicated some 6.5 million times with duraluminum rivets in each of the ZRS ships. Major subassemblies were constructed at Plant 3 and trucked to the air dock for assembly into the main ring. Triangular in construction with a Warren truss at each apex, each main ring was built on a jig forming a 36-sided polygon about 133 feet in diameter. Where airship structural rings had previously depended on spoke-like wire to maintain shape, the wireless deep ring could sustain heavy loads without collapsing. An elaborate pattern of wire stretched across each main ring was Arnstein's patented system to prevent gas cells from surging into an empty adjoining bay. Resiliency devices, acting like shock absorbers, would allow operational adjustment. Main ring 102.5 was the first to be rotated to vertical and secured on stands. The main rings were also vertical passageways equipped with stairs and Ramie cord netting. Lightweight intermediate rings were then attached to subsequent main rings for erection. 3 lightweight rings were spaced 16.4 feet apart, then braced with 36 longitudinal girders to the next main ring, forming a cell bay. The flimsy intermediate rings were braced to pulleys and counterweights on the air dock walls. Steel wire was used to stiffen the lightweight intermediate framework in a double diagonal arrangement outside the bays. Tensiometers registered proper wire tautness, allowing for wire temperature and other variables. First to completion, Bay 6 was equipped with a gas cell and subjected to extensive proof loading. Goodyear had an experimental rubberized cotton cell in the ZR-1. The new airship would use half rubberized fabric, with the other half a new gelatin latex impregnated cotton. The dozen cells accounted for some 12 acres of 5.3-ounce cotton cloth. The gas cells would have large pressure relief vents equipped with 32-inch spring-loaded valves. Each cell would have 4 valves set to open at the slight overpressure of 1.7 inches of water. For easy access, valves were positioned along the upper catwalk. Ranging in size from 100,000 to 900,000 cubic feet, each cell had its reinforced sections clearly marked where they were to contact structure. The Navy chose the imported Maybach engine over the domestic Packards that powered the first American-built Rigid. Standard in the Zeppelins, the Maybach developed 560 horsepower at a low 1,600 revolutions per minute and had the ability to run backwards. Out by Plant 3, a ship's section was built as a test stand, mounting a Maybach VL2 and drivetrain in ship's configuration. Adolf Schope's mechanical training and fluency in 2 languages made him indispensable for making operational changes. The drivetrain rig was tested day and night for 350 hours. Forward and upward thrust was provided with the turn of either engine room control shaft, swiveling the gearhead 90 degrees in as little as 40 seconds. The engineman could stop the motor, throw a lever to change the camshafts over, and use compressed air to restart the engine in the reverse direction. Turning the control shaft then provided reverse or downward thrust. The slow-turning Maybach was still too fast for the 16.5-foot propeller, so a .57 gear ratio kept the big prop below its red-lined 925 RPM. The bow section was riveted together on the floor, then the air dock cranes lifted it into place. The construction was a favorite target for yellow journalists, and various scandals made headlines. But local lobbyists finally managed to get the ZRS-4 named after their hometown, pushing to make Akron the American center of lighter-than-air. The stern was also assembled on the floor. Its center passageway would lead aft to a machine gun post in the flagstaff. Meanwhile, the Graf Zeppelin was capturing the world's attention. Newspaper magnate William Randolph Hearst had sponsored a flight to go completely around the world. Since the trip had to originate in the United States, Graf had to first journey to Lakehurst, where U.S. Navy officers Rosendahl and Richardson came aboard as observers. The only woman aboard, Lady Grace Drummond Hay, wired reports as the Graf headed over Eastern Europe. Graf passed through the Golden Gate and headed for mooring at a mast the Navy had erected at Los Angeles, low on hydrogen after popping off all day in the California sun. A temperature inversion made the replenished Graf heavy. Even after sending some of her crew ahead by train, a tail-dragging takeoff was necessary. Only skillful use of the elevator prevented a disaster in the power lines at the edge of Mines Field. Comment was made that the new Navy ship would have difficulty duplicating this feat. Once safely docked at Lakehurst, examination of the damaged tail led Lakehurst officers to instigate the controversial change number 2 in the ZRS design. Arnstein and his team fulfilled the Navy's desire to see the lower fin from the bridge by moving the control car aft 8 feet, then redesigning the arrow-like fins to be shorter in overall length. since this denied the fin root the strength of main ring 35. Intermediate ring 28.75 was beefed up to compensate. Back in Goodyear's balloon room, 1,000 miles of thread was being consumed sewing 24-inch bolts of fabric into 74-foot lengths. A tolerance of 1/32 of an inch was maintained. The average panel was stamped with 800 duraluminum eyelets on their edges. After weeks of instruction, workers climbed imported German firemen's ladders and stretched from precarious platforms. Using Ramie cord, they laced 33,000 square yards of 3-ounce fabric to the girder structure. Some areas got 3.5-ounce fabric, and everything from frame 208 forward used heavier 4-ounce fabric. Ceiling strips were glued on to cover the lacing. There were more than 5 acres of covering, and it weighed 5.5 tons all by itself. The fabric was shellacked with a nitrate dope formula which shrank it tight and made it more rainwater repellent. The final coats were impregnated with aluminum dust to reflect the sun's heat. The keel walkway's covering was not aluminized to allow sunlight into the companionways. The redesigned control car was trucked to the air dock and attached to the hull. The hull enclosed 7,400,000 cubic feet of area. Without gas cells and with interior wiring quite invisible to the camera, it appeared empty along most of its 785-foot length. 8 fireproof engine rooms, each with its 1,500-pound oil tank, protruded into the interior. Gasoline was stored in 110 tanks, 55 per side. Ranging from 120 to 400 gallons in capacity, they spread the tons of fuel weight evenly along the keels. The vertical fins were covered on the floor for easier access. Once sealed and doped, the 2,700-pound upper fin was hoisted topside and bolted into place. At the hinge line, the total horizontal fin span measured 144 feet. The barn door-sized elevators and rudders, 42 feet long and 16 feet wide, were connected by steel cables up to the control wheels on the bridge. Drawing from the small pool of experienced LTA officers and men, the Navy named Lieutenant Commander Charles Rosendahl as the USS Akron's first commanding officer. A commissioning crew reported to the air dock. 3 winches were placed on a platform above the bow door passageway. Station 210.75 was reinforced to carry the conduit for the main mooring cable, which would also pass through the spindle. The mooring spindle allowed the ship to pivot as well as pitch while secured to the heavy steel mast. The dozen khaki-colored gas cells were fitted through lower hatches and hoisted into place through upper hatches. Sleeves facilitated their inflation, and reinforced cell markings were lined up with the girder assemblies as helium gas bags pressed against the Ramie cord netting and supported the great structure for the first time. As christening day approached, the uncovered Bay 7 supported explanatory signs. On the 8th of August, Army stunt flyers turned the sky. The Goodyear blimp fleet was offering rides for $1. More than 500,000 people endured the stifling heat until 2 o'clock when Mrs. Herbert Hoover and the official party mounted the speaker's stand. Rosendahl mustered his crew, and Rear Admiral Moffett thanked Mrs. Hoover for attending. Paul Litchfield and other dignitaries made speeches about the coming age of the airship. Prohibition was the law of the land, so there could be no champagne across the bow. Mrs. Hoover released 48 doves, 1 for each state, that had been held behind Akron's forward hatches. At that signal, workers allowed the ship to float upward. The mighty USS Akron had been christened a United States vessel. When the party was over, final assembly and testing continued inside the air dock. The airship's first powered flight was only weeks away. Meanwhile, little attention had been paid to the airplane question. With the 1931 budget deficit running an unheard of $900 million, more money to design a special airplane was out of the question. The Lakehurst innovators were still drawing up the shipboard airplane handling arrangements as Akron's rollout day grew near. Some thought the necessarily short wingspan would call for a triplane. The Naval Aircraft Factory had equipped an old Vought OU-1 with a topside hook and a guard over its prop. Lakehurst had rigged USS Los Angeles with a ladder-like trapeze. In a series of daring experiments, the process of pairing the fast airplane with the long-endurance mothership became a reality. The combination proved successful and was even featured in the Hollywood movie Dirigible with Fay Wray. The movie played in Ohio as the ZRS-4 was being completed. But the ancient OU-1 was too bulky to fit inside an airship. Pensacola had some obsolete consolidated N2Y trainers sent up to the Naval Aircraft Factory, where topside hooked frameworks and prop guards, which came to be known as sky hooks, were installed. The bright yellow craft could at least be used for training. Pilots worked out the hook-on techniques on the Los Angeles trapeze. No float plane then made would fit through the Akron's door either, but it was discovered that the previously rejected XF-9C-1 fighter prototype would just make it. The Naval Aircraft Factory gave it a skyhook, and it did pretty well during tests on the Los Angeles trapeze. Glenn Curtiss got wind of what was happening and, with his own money, built an improved F-9 model. It was eventually called the XF-9Z2. Its wing was 4 inches higher for better visibility and featured several improvements. The Navy paid $1 to see it demonstrated. Innovators speculated that the airplane's landing gear could be removed for better performance, basing the planes permanently aboard the airship. The Navy placed an order for 6 of the new planes, at least filling the billet for airship protection, as the XF-9C2 was shown off as the new airship fighter. Their mothership was now ready to take to the skies.